Welcome, dear listener, to Radio Night Tales. I am Dreamweaver, and I am here to help you fall asleep by telling you spine-tingling stories with soothing sound of rain. I know you guys use my stories to fall asleep, but wait, before you do that, I want you to take a moment to like and subscribe my channel. And also tell in comments what time and place you are listening from. I hope you are done. Great. Now relax yourself and enjoy the stories I have for you.
In the peaceful town of Crestwood, Ohio, where maple trees lined quiet streets, 98-year-old Eleanor Harper lived a life of simple joys. Born on September 20th, 1919, to a modest family, Eleanor grew up with 3 siblings, tending to her mother's rose garden and dreaming of adventure. She married Thomas Harper, a World War II veteran, and together they built a cozy 2-story home on Elm Street. They had no children, but filled their days with travel and cheering for the Cleveland Guardians. After Thomas's death in 2000, Eleanor stayed independent, her garden blooming under her careful hands. She was a fixture in Crestwood, her pearl necklace and tweed jacket a familiar sight at community events. But on April 12, 2018, her light was extinguished in a way that shook the town to its core. Eleanor's niece, Clara, grew worried when phone calls went unanswered. Eleanor always checked in, her voice bright despite her age. Clara called the Crestwood police, who conducted a welfare check. The house was still. The front door was locked. Nothing seemed amiss. No broken windows, no overturned furniture. But Eleanor wasn't there. A missing persons alert went out, her photo shared across local news. That evening, Clara and her husband, Paul, joined officers to search the house again. Paul opened a hall closet, his breath catching. Beneath a pile of coats lay Eleanor's body, her clothing disheveled, her face bruised. The air grew thick with dread. The coroner's report painted a grim picture. Eleanor had been dead for days, her head and neck bearing marks of violence. No male DNA was found, a puzzling detail. Her purse was gone, along with $50 in cash. A single clue stood out, a latex glove discarded in the backyard. Police first questioned Samuel, a 30-year-old neighbor who'd helped Eleanor with chores. He was shaken, admitting his fingerprints might be in the house. His DNA didn't match the glove, clearing him. The trail went cold until a break-in at a nearby construction site yielded a suspect's phone left behind in a trailer. It belonged to a 19-year-old named Corey Vance, who, under questioning, pointed to his friend, 17-year-old Noah Kessler. Noah, a Crestwood High senior, was brought in with his mother, Linda. He admitted to petty thefts, breaking into cars, stealing wallets. After Linda left the room, he confessed to meeting men on apps to rob them, sometimes turning violent. But he denied knowing Eleanor. Then, police checked his phone. Hidden in his gallery were photos and videos of Eleanor, taken inside her home without her knowledge. Noah had creeped into her house, recording her as she slept. The evidence was damning. Cornered, he broke, his voice trembling. He said he'd entered Eleanor's home for thrills, seeking to spy on her. On April 12th, around midnight, she awoke, spotting him in her bedroom. Panicked, he tackled her, his hands closing around her throat. She struggled, her frail arms flailing, but he squeezed until she went still. What followed was unimaginable. For 2 hours, from 2:15 a.m. to 4:15 a.m., Noah lingered in the house. He filmed himself committing necrophilic acts, posing Eleanor's body in grotesque ways. One video showed him dragging her across the living room, a gloved hand at her throat. Another captured him undressing her, using gloves to avoid leaving traces. He posed her on a chair, his camera rolling, her lifeless eyes staring into the dark. He left only when his parents' morning routine loomed, stashing her body in the closet to cover his tracks. He took her purse, tossing it later, keeping the cash. A raid on Noah's home on Oak Street uncovered the matching glove, Eleanor's purse, and a journal chilling in its clarity. Pages dated January 2018 detailed fantasies of murder and assault, with one entry reading, "I want to feel their life slip away, to know I'm the one who decides." Noah idolized killers, his words dripping with intent. "I need to stand over a body, to feel that power." A forensic psychologist, Dr. Emily Chen, evaluated him, diagnosing conduct disorder, sexual sadism, and substance abuse issues, alcohol, marijuana, and prescription pills. Noah drank heavily, a bottle of whiskey daily. Dr. Chen warned he was criminally sophisticated, showing no desire to change. At 10, he'd chased his siblings with a knife, a red flag ignored. At trial, Noah's mother Linda blamed his medication, an antidepressant prescribed months before. She faltered under cross-examination, admitting his drug use, liquor, LSD, pills, could have played a role. The defense tried to suppress the phone evidence, but the judge denied it. Noah pleaded no contest to 9 charges, 4 counts of aggravated murder, 2 of murder, kidnapping, burglary, and abuse of a corpse. The courtroom was silent as the judge sentenced him to life without parole, plus 21 years for the other charges, to run consecutively. Noah's appeal failed, his fate sealed. Eleanor's death hit Crestwood hard. Clara spoke to reporters, her voice breaking. "She was our anchor. How could someone do this?" The community held a funeral on April 20th, 2018, at Crestwood's Grace Funeral Home. Hundreds gathered, laying roses by her grave at Maple Grove Cemetery beside Thomas. Her stone to stone bore a carved dove, symbolizing peace she'd been denied. But a shadow lingered. Ohio Senate Bill 256, passed in 2021, allowed juvenile offenders parole eligibility, even for murder, after 25 years. Noah, 17 at the time of the crime, could walk free one day. A petition to amend the law gained only 800 signatures, its plea drowned out by reform advocates arguing for second chances. Clara, now in her 60s, remembered Eleanor babysitting her as a child, crafting paper dolls and baking cookies. She said, "This could have been anyone's grandmother," her eyes wet. The bill's passage felt like a betrayal, forcing families to relive their pain at parole hearings. Noah had told detectives he'd kill again if not caught, a confession that chilled investigators. Crestwood streets stayed quiet, but Eleanor's murder left a scar, a reminder that evil could lurk behind a neighbor's smile, and justice, even when served, could feel fragile.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's hop on to the next one. In the rugged Tigray region of Ethiopia, where war scars stain the land, a little girl named Ida shone like a fleeting ray of light. Born in September 2016, Ida, meaning blessing in her native tongue, was a 7-year-old with a radiant spirit. Her mother, Salam Yohannes, a nurse in a local clinic, often worked long shifts, leaving Ida and her younger sister, 3-year-old Muna, with relatives. Ida's hugs were Salam's refuge after grueling days, the girl's laughter a balm against the chaos of a region torn by conflict. Tigray was a battleground, caught in a brutal civil war from 2020 to 2022 between Ethiopia's federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
a group branded as terrorists by many nations. The war left thousands dead, displaced a third of the population, and choked off aid. Ida's father, a Tigrayan, was imprisoned by federal forces for reasons never made public, leaving Salam to raise her daughters alone in a world of uncertainty. Ida knew war's weight too well for her age. Her village, nestled among Tigray's rocky hills, echoed with stories of famine and violence. Yet she clung to small joys, playing with Muna, sharing whispered secrets under the stars. Salam trusted her brother-in-law, Theodoros, to watch the girls when work called. Theodoros, 34, was a man hardened by the region's strife, his eyes carrying a quiet menace. To neighbors, he was a helper, always ready with a smile. But behind that mask lay something darker, a cruelty that would soon shatter lives. On a cool evening in late 2022, as Tigray's fragile ceasefire held, tragedy struck. Salam left Ida with Theodoros, expecting to return to her daughter's warm embrace. Hours passed. The night grew heavy. Salam's phone calls to Theodoros went unanswered. Panic clawed at her chest. She rushed home, finding the house eerily silent. Ida was gone. Muna, curled up asleep, knew nothing. Theodoros was nowhere to be found. Salam's screams awoke the neighbors, who joined her in a frantic search through the village's dusty paths. The next morning, a chilling discovery stopped the village cold. Ida's body was found in a shallow ditch near a dry riverbed, her small frame battered, her clothes torn. Ligature marks circled her wrists, suggesting she'd been bound. Bruises marred her face and neck, signs of a struggle. The autopsy later revealed blunt force trauma and possible strangulation. Her killer had struck to subdue her, then ensured her silence. Strands of rope stained with her blood lay nearby. The village mourned, their grief a heavy shroud, but suspicion quickly fell on Theodoros. He'd vanished, leaving only whispers of his guilt. Salam's world crumbled. She took to the streets, demanding justice, her voice raw with pain. But Tigray's chaos worked against her. The war had gutted local police, leaving investigations sluggish. Some whispered Theodoros had ties to the TPLF, granting him protection. Others said he'd fled to Eritrea, where tensions with Ethiopia were rising. Salam's pleas drew attention, but not the kind she hoped. Threats came. Notes slipped under her door, strange men lingering near her home. They wanted her silent. She wasn't. She spoke to anyone who'd listen, from local elders to aid workers, her courage a beacon in the dark. The case caught the eye of a local musician, Dawit, whose band Light of Hope sang for Ethiopia's forgotten. Dawit, 29, had lost his own sister to the war's violence. Ida's story hit him hard. He wrote a song, Radiance Lost, its haunting melody echoing her name. I wanted her story to burn in people's hearts, he said later, his voice thick. The song spread, played at rallies and on radio, its lyrics a call to protect Tigray's children. Light of Hope, tied to an education nonprofit, pushed for reforms, demanding better systems to shield the vulnerable. Ethiopia's Minister of Women praised their work, but change was slow. Investigators, hampered by the region's instability, pieced together what they could. Witnesses recalled Theodoros acting strangely the night Ida vanished. He'd been seen loading a bag into his truck, his hands shaking. A neighbor heard Ida's faint cry, dismissed as a child's tantrum. Another saw Theodorus near the riverbed hours before dawn. Salam shared a chilling detail. Ida had recently seemed afraid of her uncle, clinging to her mother more than usual. Had she sensed his darkness? The autopsy suggested Theodorus acted alone, luring Ida from the house under some pretense, perhaps a walk to see the stars. In a remote spot, he overpowered her, binding her hands to stop her fighting back. The brutality was calculated, meant to silence her quickly. Theodorus remained a ghost. Some said he hid in Eritrea, others that he died in a skirmish. Salam faced harassment for speaking out, her home vandalized, her job threatened. Yet she persisted, joining mothers who'd lost children to the war's ripples. They held vigils, Ida's name painted on banners. A fundraiser covered her funeral, held in a small church under Tigray's gray sky. Hundreds came, laying flowers on her tiny grave, their tears mixing with the dust. Salam vowed to keep fighting, for Ida and for Muna, who still woke crying for her sister. The case exposed Tigray's wounds. The war had stretched resources thin, leaving children like Ida unprotected. Advocacy groups criticized police for treating her case as an afterthought, focusing on military threats instead. Ida's death wasn't just a crime, it was a symptom of a broken system, where war's chaos let monsters thrive. Dawit's song kept her memory alive, its notes carrying her story beyond Tigray. As 2025 dawned, with Eritrea and Ethiopia teetering toward new conflict, Salam feared more children would suffer. Ida's laughter was gone, but her mother's fight burned on. A demand that no child be forgotten in the shadow of war.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's hop on to the next one.
In the quiet town of Valdosta, Georgia, the sun rose over Lowndes High School on January 11, 2013, casting long shadows across its sprawling campus. Marcus Bryant, a 17-year-old junior, was the heartbeat of his family. Born in October 1995 to David and Angela Bryant, he was the youngest of 3 siblings, a boy with a quick laugh and a knack for numbers. On the football field, he was a rising star, dreaming of the NFL. In the classroom, science and math came easy, his mind sharp and curious. But that morning, Marcus's dreams were snuffed out in a way that defied reason. His body was found inside a rolled-up wrestling mat in the school's old gymnasium, his legs protruding, his head buried deep within the coil. The sight was grotesque, unnatural, like the mat had consumed him. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office was quick to call it an accident. They claimed Marcus had climbed into the mat to grab a pair of sneakers, only to get stuck and suffocate. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's autopsy backed this up, listing positional asphyxia as the cause of death. Marcus, they said, had been trapped upside down, his lungs compressed, his breath stolen. But his parents, David and Angela, refused to believe it. Something felt wrong. Their son was athletic, cautious. He wouldn't have made such a reckless move. And then came the details that turned their grief into suspicion. It was January 9th, 2013, the first day back after winter break. Lowndes High had 2 gyms, an older, smaller one, and a newer, larger one. In the old gym, wrestling mats stood upright in a corner, used by students like Marcus to store belongings and avoid locker fees. Over the break, more mats had been added, shuffled around. On January 10th at 1:35 p.m., blurry security footage showed Marcus entering the old gym alone. He never came out. He missed his weightlifting class. He didn't show up for the freshman basketball game he'd planned to watch. His phone rang unanswered. By midnight, Angela's worry turned to dread. She reported him missing. The next morning, Angela arrived at the school, her chest tight with fear. She begged administrators for answers. They printed flyers with Marcus's photo, smiling in his football jersey. Around 10:40 a.m., a group of girls sat atop the mats, filling out class surveys. One noticed socks sticking out of a mat. She giggled, thinking it was a prank. Then she climbed up and looked inside. Her scream shattered the gym's quiet. Marcus's body was wedged inside, his face swollen, eyes wide in silent terror. A boy tried to pull him out, but stopped, gagging at the smell of decay. A teacher rushed over, knocking the mat down. Marcus's body slumped forward, lifeless. The school locked down. Students herded to the new gym as chaos erupted. Angela's world collapsed when a principal delivered the news. Marcus had been in that mat for nearly 21 hours, alone in the dark. The official story seemed too neat, too quick. When the Bryants demanded a second autopsy, the horror deepened. Marcus's organs, heart, lungs, liver, brain were gone, replaced with crumpled newspaper. The funeral home claimed it was standard practice for decomposed bodies, but the Bryants saw it as a violation, a cover-up. The independent autopsy, done by a private pathologist, found blunt force trauma to his neck, contradicting the official ruling. Had he been struck, killed, hidden in the mat to stage an accident? The investigation raised more questions than answers. Students in the gym that day told consistent stories, but gaps remained. A video of the scene showed blood pooled under Marcus's head, yet none was found outside the mat. His yellow notebook and sneakers were nearby, untouched by blood. A streak of blood on a nearby pillar tested negative for Marcus's DNA. Bloody tissues in a girl's bathroom traced back to a student with a nosebleed. Marcus's socks were half off, twisted oddly. The Bryants rejected the accident narrative, turning to the NAACP and local activists. Protests flared. David and Angela were arrested for disrupting a courthouse rally, their voices hoarse from demanding truth. Rumors swirled about two brothers, Ethan and Caleb Reed, sons of a local FBI agent. The Bryants believed they were involved, pointing to a rumored fight over a girl. But Ethan was out of state that day, Caleb elsewhere on campus, their alibis airtight. The case grew murky. Surveillance footage, the key to clarity, was riddled with holes. An hour and 5 minutes were missing from 2 gym cameras, 2 hours and 10 minutes from others. Timestamps didn't align. Gym cameras ran 10 minutes ahead of outdoor ones. The footage showed Marcus entering at 1:35 p.m., but what happened before? Who else was there? The IT staff, not police, handled the tapes, handing them over 5 days later. A forensic analyst found corrupted files, lost images, a fractured timeline. Evidence, it seemed, had been tampered with. The Bryants filed a lawsuit, naming the Reed brothers, school officials, and police, alleging a staged scene. But without witnesses or hard proof, the case stalled. The Department of Justice investigated, but shared nothing. The coroner's report called the handling poor, noting the body was moved before officials arrived. A sealed body bag had been opened. The second autopsy's findings, blunt force trauma, clashed with the GBI's no significant injuries report. The Bryants exhumed Marcus's body twice, spending thousands chasing answers. They accused the system of protecting the powerful, pointing to the Reed father's influence. Law enforcement stood firm. Accident. Case closed. Valdosta moved on, but the Bryants didn't. They held vigils, spoke at rallies, their pain raw. Marcus's death was a coin with two sides, accident or murder. The official story said he reached too far, got stuck, and died slowly, oxygen fading as he struggled. Positional asphyxia, silent and cruel, fit the scene. Blood in his mouth, darkened skin, fluid in his lungs. But the missing organs, the tampered footage, the untested blood, they screamed cover-up. The Bryants believe Marcus was lured to the gym, killed and hidden. 10 years later, the truth stayed buried, lost in corrupted files and official denials. Somewhere, someone knew what happened. Marcus's smile, once the light of his family, now haunted Valdosta, a reminder that justice could slip through the cracks of a small town's silence.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's hop on to the next one.
The streets of America hid a predator for decades, a man who moved like a shadow, leaving death in his wake. Samuel Hayes, born on June 10, 1940, in the small, struggling town of Millersville, Georgia, was a monster cloaked in charm. Raised in poverty, his mother, a prostitute, abandoned him as a toddler, leaving him on a dusty roadside. His grandmother took him in, raising him in Canton, Ohio, where he grew up watching the world through a lens of neglect. By 16, Samuel was already in trouble, arrested for breaking into a corner store. It was the first of many crimes: assault, theft, fraud, robbery. He was a drifter, sliding through 11 states by his 30s, always slipping through the law's fingers. But beneath his petty crimes, a darker urge grew. From 1970 to 2005, Samuel Hayes became the deadliest serial killer in U.S. history, confessing to 93 murders, mostly of women society overlooked: sex workers, runaways, addicts. In 1971, Hayes claimed his first victim in Miami, Florida. Her name was Tanya, a vibrant 19-year-old black transgender woman, about 5'6", slim, with a warm smile. They met at a dive bar, the Rusty Anchor, where neon lights buzzed and jukebox music drowned out the night. Tanya, trusting, accepted a ride home. Hayes lured her to a remote stretch of Highway 29, his hands tightening around her throat until her struggles stopped. He dumped her body in a murky canal, the water swallowing her without a trace. He drove away, unfazed, blending back into the city's pulse. His second victim, in 1972, was a woman he called Jane. Dark-skinned, petite, she worked the streets to survive. Hayes picked her up near a military base, his words smooth, promising safety. In a wooded lot, he smothered her, leaving her body among the pines, certain no one would care. By the mid-70s, he met Carla, a 22-year-old prostitute with a University of Miami ID. Her strong legs and bright eyes caught his attention. After a brief struggle on a back road, he beat her to death, hiding her under a pile of debris. A man watched from afar, but Hayes walked away, untouched. In 1976, he crossed paths with Denise, a 29-year-old he'd known through a mutual friend years earlier. She was hurting, venting about her abusive husband at a liquor store. Hayes offered a ride, then strangled her in a field, her body left in tall grass. In 1978, he met Lena, a curvy woman dancing at a bar in cut-off jeans. Her siblings knew Hayes as Sam. He drove her to a desolate railroad track, strangled her, and kept her scarf as a trophy. In North Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1980, he met Ruthie, tall and quiet, on a snowy night. After 3 days together, he choked her on a dirt road, leaving her near a cornfield. In Los Angeles, 1987, Hayes entered a dealer's house and saw Marie, a young woman in shorts. Her pimp sent her with him. In an abandoned garage, he strangled her after a fall from a ledge, her body left among paint cans. Later that year, he met Sandra, a woman he mocked as a junkie in a tight dress. He choked her near a laundromat, hanging her body in dense brush. In 1990, a 20-year-old with a red headband and tattoos trusted him for drugs. In the Hollywood Hills, he beat her to death, tossing her body down a slope. In 1993, he lured Anita, a heavy-set woman in a turban, during a riot. As rain fell, he smothered her,
leaving her on a bank's lawn, posed as if asleep. Hayes's crime stretched across 14 states, his victims chosen for their vulnerability. He was arrested dozens of times, 26 by age 35, for everything from shoplifting to assaulting police, but murder charges never stuck. In 1982, in Pascagoula, Mississippi, he was questioned in the death of 23-year-old Melissa Tate, but the grand jury let him go. In Florida, witnesses tied him to 27-year-old Laura Mills, but their testimonies were dismissed. In 1984, in San Diego, he attacked 21-year-old Gina Ruiz, who survived, and another woman, barely alive, in his car. He served just 2 years. Released in 1987, he killed 10 more in Los Angeles alone. The law finally caught up on September 10, 2012, in a Louisville shelter on a drug charge. A DNA test linked him to 3 Los Angeles murders from the 1980s. Clara Jones, strangled in July 1987, Rosa Gomez, killed in September 1987, and Ellen Parker, dumped in August 1989. The evidence cracked the case wide open. By 2014, Hayes faced trial for those killings. DNA, survivor testimonies, and his own chilling confessions sealed his fate. On September 30th, 2014, he was convicted and sentenced to life without parole in California State Prison. But Hayes wasn't done talking. In November 2018, he confessed to strangling Monica Reed in 1995, then admitted to killing Diane Brooks in 1993. Over weeks, he detailed 90 more murders, his memory razor sharp, victims' faces, heights, weights, the roads where he left them. He sketched their portraits, hauntingly accurate, helping the FBI close cold cases. In Ohio, his drawings identified a woman dumped near Route 71. In Alabama, he named Brenda Cole. In Louisiana, Dorothy Lane and Daisy Hart. In Mississippi, Julia Wells. Each confession was a gut punch, his lack of remorse chilling. He taunted police, laughing at their failures. Hayes's girlfriend, Evelyn Gorsey, stood by him for years, even aiding in a 1972 robbery acquittal. She died in 1988 from a stroke, leaving him to kill alone. His health crumbled, diabetes, heart issues, but he kept confessing until his death on December 28, 2020, in a Los Angeles hospital. No cause was listed, but his body was worn out. Unlike his victims, he died peacefully, a cruel irony. Author Karen Holt spent 40 hours with Hayes, her book, Facing the Beast, born from those interviews. She'd planned a novel, but uncovered a real nightmare. His sketches and stories gave names to the forgotten. Women's society ignored, their deaths unsolved for decades. Hayes thrived on that indifference, targeting the less dead. His confessions freed wrongly convicted men in Florida, gave families closure, but offered no redemption. He died unrepentant, his crimes a stain on history. The system had failed his victims, letting him kill for 35 years. Their names, now spoken, demand justice never be so blind again.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's hop on to the next one. The small town of Harper, Arkansas was a quiet place, where the hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves were often the loudest sounds on a summer night. In 1996, the Thompson family, James, Sarah, their 8-year-old daughter Emily, and 5-year-old son Noah, lived in a modest home on a sprawling lot along County Road. James, 32, was a hard-working man, juggling shifts as a welder and a part-time handyman to keep his family afloat. Sarah, 28, cared for her aging mother and stepfather, who lived in a small trailer behind the house. Both elderly, they battled frail health, her mother with early signs of dementia, her stepfather nearly deaf. The Thompsons were close-knit, their lives woven into the fabric of Harper's tight community, where neighbors waved from porches and secrets rarely stayed hidden. But beneath the town's calm surface, a shadow loomed.
Harper's remote location and sparse police presence made it a quiet hub for drug deals, a fact most residents ignored until it spilled into their lives. On the night of August 12, 1996, a violent storm tore through Harper. Rain lashed the ground, turning dirt roads to mud. Thunder rattled windows. Around 1:30 a.m., Deputy Mark Tanner got a call about a disturbance at the Thompson home. The wind howled as he pulled up, the house dark except for faint flickers from a TV. Shouts echoed from inside, barely audible over the storm. By the time Tanner reached the porch, the noise had stopped. No lights flickered. No one answered his knocks. Assuming the storm had drowned out a harmless argument, he drove off. He couldn't have known the horror already unfolding. Morning broke, gray and heavy. Sarah's mother, Ellen, shuffled to her trailer's door, expecting to check on her daughter. The door wouldn't open. Something blocked it. She pushed harder, but it held fast. Annoyed, she circled to the side entrance. There, on the steps, lay Sarah, 28, her body crumpled, lifeless. Blood streaked the doorframe, a smeared handprint stark against the wood. Ellen's scream pierced the morning. Her husband, Walter, stumbled out, his face pale as he saw his stepdaughter. Sheriff Daniel Holt arrived soon after, his boots sinking into the muddy yard. He nudged the front door open, calling out. Silence answered, save for the low hum of that TV. Inside, the scene turned his stomach. In the living room, Noah Thompson, just 5, lay on the carpet, his dinosaur pajamas stained red. His small body was still, his face frozen in fear. Blood trailed across the floor, smearing the kitchen tiles and pooling near a toy truck on the table. Holt's heart sank as he moved through the house. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Overturned chairs, a shattered lamp. Sarah's body outside suggested she'd tried to flee, maybe to reach her mother's trailer. But 2 family members were missing, James and Emily. The sheriff's mind raced. In cases like this, the spouse was always the first suspect. James's absence, along with his daughters, raised red flags. Had he snapped, taken Emily and run? Or was something darker at play? 2 days later, a fisherman found James Thompson's body in the nearby Black River. He'd been shot twice in the head with a .22 pistol, his throat slashed shallowly, as if the killer wanted him to suffer. The coroner's report was grim. Sarah had been bludgeoned 25 times with a crowbar, the final blow piercing her throat, severing her artery. Noah's injuries were even brutal. His skull cracked, jaw broken, stab wounds riddling his tiny frame. The weapon, a bloodied crowbar, lay discarded near the porch. The question gnawed at investigators. Where was Emily, the 8-year-old girl? For 2 years, Harper held its breath. Search parties scoured woods and fields. Flyers with Emily's face, smiling, gap-toothed, faded on telephone poles. Every lead fizzled. Hope dimmed. Then, on October 5th, 1998, a hiker in the remote Pine Hollow woods stumbled across bones in a dry creek bed. The remains were small, fragile. Dental records confirmed the worst. They were Emily's. Decomposition hid the cause of death, but the truth was clear. She'd been taken from her family, her life stolen. Suspicion turned to the Carter family, a rough crew from nearby Polk County. Roy Carter, 50, ran a drug operation. His son Ethan, 29, his right-hand man. James Thompson had once been tight with Ethan, moving small batches of marijuana together. They were friends, or so it seemed, until a falling out. Whispers spread that James had swiped a stash of Roy's product, a bold move that sparked rage. Others said Sarah had begged a friend for a $12,000 loan, claiming they owed the Carters and feared retaliation. The Carters were no strangers to violence. Roy had a rap sheet stretching back decades. Ethan known for his quick temper. Police leaned on them,
but evidence was thin. No arrests stuck. Then in June 1991, a break came. Roy's ex-wife, Linda Carter, came forward with a chilling story. She told detectives that on August 11, 1996, Ethan had called Roy, who left their house without a word. He returned hours later, shaken. 2 years after the murders, Roy confessed to Linda Ethan had killed the Thompsons. Roy said he only helped clean up afterwards. Ethan, however, pointed the finger back, claiming Roy was the mastermind. The conflicting stories muddied the case, but Linda's tip gave police leverage. On June 12, 2001, Roy and Ethan Carter were arrested on unrelated drug charges. In custody, Ethan broke. Facing a possible life sentence, he took a plea deal for 45 years and agreed to testify against his father. His account was harrowing. James had stolen from Roy, enraging him. That stormy night, Ethan lured James out, claiming his truck broke down. James, ever the helper, drove to meet him. Roy was waiting. 2 shots to James' head ended it. They dumped his body in the river. Back at the Thompson house, Roy took over. Noah, waking to the noise, ran to the door. Roy silenced him with the crowbar, each strike deliberate. Sarah fought hard, but Roy was relentless, beating her until she collapsed. She crawled towards her mother's trailer, only for Roy to finish her on the steps. Emily's fate was the cruelest. Roy found her hiding in her closet, trembling. He wrapped her in a blanket, taped her mouth, and carried her to the car. Ethan swore she was alive then, her eyes wide with fear. For 2 days they kept her in a shed, the summer heat suffocating. Roy's final words to her, Ethan recalled, were cold. Everything ends. He drove her to Pine Hollow, drowned her in the creek, and slashed her throat to be sure. The brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. In 2002, Roy and Ethan Carter faced trial. Ethan's testimony painted Roy as the killer, but Roy turned the tables, claiming Ethan acted alone. A jailhouse insider, Roy's former cellmate, said Roy admitted Ethan abused Emily before the murders, and James planned to report it. That, Roy claimed, sparked Ethan's rage. The jury didn't buy Roy's story. Both men were convicted of 4 counts of murder and kidnapping. Roy got the death penalty. Ethan, with his plea, got 45 years. But in 2004, Roy's conviction was overturned. A witness had testified about an unrelated crime, tainting the trial. A retrial in 2008 saw Ethan refuse to testify, avoiding his deal. Roy took the stand, pinning it all on Ethan. A new witness, another cellmate, backed Roy's claim that Ethan killed to silence James. In the end, both Roy and Ethan Carter were sentenced to life without parole, plus 45 years for Emily's kidnapping. Ethan faced extra time for unrelated assaults, his history of predatory behavior adding weight to the theory that Emily's abuse drove the murders. The Thompsons were buried together in Harper's Oakwood Cemetery, their graves a quiet reminder of a town forever changed. The Carters' conflicting stories left some questions unanswered, but the judge ensured justice by locking them away for life. Harper's streets stayed quiet, but the scars of that night lingered, a warning of the darkness that can hide in even the smallest towns.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Now let's hop on to the next one. In the humid spring of 2017, Augusta, Georgia buzzed with the quiet rhythm of a small city. At the heart of one family was 16-year-old Jada Monroe, a bright spark with dreams bigger than her circumstances. Born in February 2001, Jada was a junior at Glen Hills High School, her quick wit shining in English class. She loved sketching dresses, hoping to design her own fashion line one day. and sang in her church choir, her voice carrying a soulful hope. Her mother, Renee Monroe, 39, worked as a cashier, scraping by to support Jada and her younger brother, 10-year-old Malik. Renee's husband, Derek Tripp, 42, was Jada's stepfather, a man with a temper and a past, arrested in 1998 for domestic violence and again in 2006 for theft. Their home on Thomas Lane was cramped, its peeling paint hiding tensions that simmered beneath the surface. On April 17, 2017, Jada vanished. Renee told police Jada had gone to visit her grandmother, but the grandmother hadn't seen her. Jada's phone was off, her social media silent. Her friends, worried, said she'd seemed withdrawn lately, mentioning fights at home. Renee's story shifted. She claimed Jada ran away after an argument over chores. But Jada wasn't the type to disappear without a word. She'd left her sketchbook behind, its pages half filled with designs, and her choir robe hung untouched in her closet. The Richmond County Sheriff's Office launched a search, flyers with Jada's photo, smiling, her braids framing her face, plastered across Augusta. Weeks passed with no leads. Then, on May 31st, 2017, a grim discovery in a wooded lot off Old Savannah Road shook the case. Human remains, badly decomposed, were found near a creek alongside a burned-out car. Dental records confirmed it was Jada. The autopsy revealed a fractured skull and multiple stab wounds to her chest, the brutality suggesting rage. A bloodied kitchen knife, partially melted, was recovered near the car, its handle bearing traces of Derek's DNA. The car, a 2008 Honda Civic, was registered to Renee. The scene told a story of violence and cover-up, but the details were murky. Investigators zeroed in on Derek and Renee. Derek, a handyman with a history of odd jobs, claimed he'd been working a roofing gig the day Jada disappeared. His alibi crumbled. No employer could confirm it. Renee admitted to lying about Jada's whereabouts, saying she'd panicked when her daughter didn't come home. But her calm demeanor raised red flags. A neighbor recalled hearing screams from the Monroe house on April 16, followed by Derek loading trash bags into his truck late that night. Another saw Renee scrubbing the kitchen floor at dawn, unusual for her. Cell phone records placed Derek near the crime scene on April 17, his phone pinging a tower half a mile from the creek. Under pressure, Derek cracked on June 15, 2017, during a 10-hour interrogation. He confessed to killing Jada, but claimed it was an accident. He said they'd argued over her disrespectful attitude toward Renee. Jada, he alleged, grabbed a knife from the counter, and in a struggle, he wrested it away, striking her head with the handle. She fell, bleeding, and he panicked, stabbing her to stop her suffering. His story didn't add up. The stab wounds were deliberate, deep, and numerous. He admitted driving her body to the lot, dousing the car with gasoline, and setting it ablaze to destroy evidence. Renee, he insisted, knew nothing. But Renee's role unraveled. Text messages between her and Derek, recovered from her phone, showed that she'd urged him to handle Jada's behavior days before the murder. One read, "She's out of control. Do what you need to." A friend of Renee's told police she'd complained about Jada's defiance, saying she wished she'd disappear. When confronted, Renee admitted to helping Derek clean blood from the kitchen, claiming she thought it was from a fight between him and Jada. She'd burned Jada's clothes in a backyard fire pit, ashes later found by forensic teams. Her complicity was clear. She'd helped cover up her daughter's murder. On July 10, 2017, Derek was charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and arson. Renee faced charges of second-degree murder and accessory after the fact.
At Derek's trial in March 2018, prosecutors painted him as a controlling figure who saw Jada's independence as a threat. Witnesses testified to his temper. Jada's friends said she'd feared him, once showing bruises she blamed on a fall. The knife's DNA and the car's ownership tied him to the crime, and his confession, though inconsistent, sealed his fate. He was convicted on all counts, sentenced to life without parole plus 20 years. Renee took a plea deal, testifying against Derek to reduce her sentence. She described him as abusive, claiming she acted out of fear. The jury didn't buy her tears. She got 25 years, eligible for parole in 2035. Jada's death exposed a household fractured by control and resentment. Derek's prior convictions, ignored by Renee when she married him, hinted at a pattern of violence. Jada's journal, found in her room, revealed her pain. "I just want to be free, to draw and sing and not be afraid." Her brother, Malik, was placed with his grandmother, his childhood scarred by loss. Augusta's community rallied, holding a vigil at Jada's church, where her choir sang her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace. A scholarship in her name was set up at Glen Hills, funding art supplies for students with dreams like hers. The case left Augusta grappling with hard truths. Domestic violence, often hidden behind closed doors, had claimed a young life. Social services had visited the Monroe home twice before, after teacher reports of Jada's bruises, but found no conclusive evidence. The system had failed her, much like it failed others in overburdened communities. Jada's story lingered, her sketches displayed at a local art gallery in 2019, a tribute to a girl whose light was stolen too soon. Renee's parole hearings loomed, a painful reminder for those who love Jada that justice could feel incomplete.
Well, my dear listeners, that's all I had for tonight. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Now please relax yourselves and let the land of dreams wrap you while you listen to the sound of rain. Good night. I will see you again tomorrow.